Welcome to the Book Fair Podcast. My name is Anthony. Every Wednesday, we cover new releases and the latest headlines impacting libraries and the freedom to read. Today, we have an interview with Nancy Hudgins, author of the new middle grade biography, Books Good Enough for You. The storied life of Ursula Nordstrom, editor of extraordinary children's books. Next week, we will have an interview with Tui T. Sutherland, author of the Wings of Fire series, as well as the latest middle grade YA and picture book releases. Make sure you follow the Book Fair wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date with the latest in children's literature. Let's get started with this week's interview with Nancy Hudgins. Thank you so much for being here today, Nancy. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for giving me your time. Can you start off by introducing yourself for the audience and the work that we'll be discussing today?
Sure. My name is Nancy Hudgins. I've written a children's book, but that's something I've done very recently. Um, I grew up loving to read, and my first job, actually, for which I got a W-2, was as a working at a library, the public library, as a page. So I read a lot as a kid, and uh, I did all these other different things, but mostly I was a lawyer and also a mediator, somebody who helps people resolve their disputes. And then as I was getting close to the end of those careers, I decided that I wanted to do something that would be not only intellectually interesting to me, but also uh, a give back to kids and kids who like to read and even kids who don't like to read. So I spent a lot of time in the last 10 years attending seminars and working with critique partners and writing a lot of picture books. I started out with picture books that none of which have been published yet. And uh, and then when I saw that a picture book about Ursula Nordstrom, who my book is about, came out, I or was going to come out. It was there was a notice it was coming out. I realized that no publishing house was going to put out two picture books of Ursula Nordstrom in a short period of time. So I changed to middle grade. And so one of the things I really like about middle grade is it gave me the space to write a whole lot more about the books that Ursula edited. So some of the books that your listeners will know that she edited, she was a children's book department editor at Harper and Row from 1940 to 1973. So she edited The Runaway Bunny and Goodnight Moon with Margaret Weiss Brown. They were the same age, and so they were friends, and both lived in the Village in New York City. She edited E.B. White, Stuart Little, and Charlotte's Web. Um, she edited Harold and the Purple Crayon. She discovered Maurice Sendak, sent him maybe 50 books for him to illustrate, encouraged him to write his own books, and helped him with Where the Wild Things Are and almost all of his other books until the mid 70s. So just an amazing person during a time when most women were uh, not given the chance to do amazing things, and she took the opportunity and she was a trailblazer, and one of the reasons that uh, books today are a lot more um, available to kids to see who they are in the books. She said that that books for children should be fresh and original and honest. Anything else, she said, is not good enough for a child. And so I titled my book, it's a biography of Ursula Nordstrom, but I titled it Books Good Enough for You, meaning books good enough for children or whoever's reading this book or who read these books as children. So Books Good Enough for You, the storied life of Ursula Nordstrom, editor of extraordinary children's books. I think I buried the
And
lead. That's my new book.
that's okay. And Ursula used the phrase good enough for you, specifically as an editor. Can you talk a little bit about where that phrase came from in her position as an editor and how she used that to provide feedback?
I really don't know the derivation of the name and of the acronym, and I've never really seen it in in any other books about editors, but she decided that she was a great champion of the writers and illustrators she worked with, and she wanted all of their books to be as good as they could be. And so, if she read a paragraph or a sentence or something, and she just thought it was off kilter or that was too easy and not really thoughtful or whatever, she would say, "Not good enough for you." And in one particular uh, case, Mary Stoltz, who was one of her young adult writers, said and she would, Ursula would change it and write in the margins of the manuscripts NGEFY for not good enough for you. And Mary Stoltz said, uh, the great thing about Ursula was even when you got something that said NGFY, you did everything you could to meet her expectations and make it as good as you could be. So she was quite a motivator of people.
And when it comes to talking about expectations, looking at the landscape of publishing at the time, especially with Harper and Row, the book points out that the men in charge of the company saw the boys and girls department as lesser than. It was a necessary part of the industry, but it wasn't profitable, and so they didn't put as much attention to it. Can you talk a little bit about how the expectation that Ursula had for the work kind of clashed with the expectations that the industry had for children's books?
So I don't really know what the men at Harper and other publishing houses were thinking, but uh, Ursula came well, in that time period for them, there were no children's book departments until maybe 1910 or so. And in fact, the first one at Harper was Virginia Kirkus, who went on to do the Kirkus Review. But when she retired, the men in charge of Harper just turned to her assistant and said, "Hey, will you do this job?" And she said, "Sure." And so then when that assistant retired, who was Ursula's boss, the men turned to Ursula, who was only 29, and said, "Will you do this job?" And she said, "Sure." So, so she kind of took the bull by the horns and just wanted. I think one of the reasons I spend many chapters on her early editorialship, editorship, I guess it um, is because I was. It was interesting to me to see how she developed as an editor. So I don't think she started out with NGEFY, but uh, uh, she took herself very seriously. She wanted children's books to reflect the children who were reading them, so that they could see themselves in those books. And she was a very very hard worker and what would call a type A personality, I'm sure. Um, and so she just wanted to be great and took children seriously, I guess I should say, which was a major part of it too. And as a matter of fact, because of to go into your point about making them profitable, um, because of the popularity of Margaret Weiss Brown's books and uh, books by Ruth Krauss, who did uh, many books with Ursula and also with Maurice Sendak. With Maurice Sendak, the fact that she uh, published books by E.B. White, all started to make her department very profitable. And near the time that she retired in the 70s, it was actually the most profitable department in the whole of Harvard. So she did all right. And I think one of the reasons she had that kind of longevity is that she produced really 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 good books that had wide circulation and lots of sales.
And looking at the landscape at the time, you said that Ursula was a trailblazer. Can you talk a little bit about the community around children's books, particularly the influence that the American Library Association had, and definitely the conflict that Ursula had with Anne Carroll Moore when she began her journey with Harper and Row?
Yeah, sure. Anne Carroll Moore is a very interesting person in children's book history. She did a lot of great things. She started the first children's library room within the New York Public Library. She used child-sized furniture and did puppet shows and all kind and summer reading and actually the day it first opened in New York City, the line was around the block of kids waiting to get in. Up until that time, which is about I, I'm going to guess 1910 in that era, uh, no one under the age of 14 was allowed in the New York Public Library. So libraries were seen as something for adults and not really for children. So I think these two things happened at the same time. The librarians began to uh, study and work on and promote children's books, and people got more interested in writing them. Ursula happened to be at the right place at the right time. So uh, the contretemps that Ursula and Anne Carroll Moore had basically, I think, is because they're both strong-willed, and uh, Anne Carroll Moore was the undisputed children's librarian in that time. I mean, just known nationwide. Yeah, I'm sure she was involved in all of the Newbery and Caldecott selections. Um, and so when she first met Ursula, remember at this point is like in her early 30s, and Anne Carroll Moore is probably 60 or so. She looked at Ursula and she said, "What makes you think you can be a children's book editor? You're not a librarian. You're not a teacher. How do you think you can do this job?" And Ursula just looked at her and said, "I was a child once and I haven't forgotten a thing." And she stood up to her, which I thought was brave and showed that she was going to be tough enough to do this job. And they did have, as they went along, and particularly because Anne Carroll Moore knew E.B. White because of his adult books as well. Um, Anne Carroll Moore was unhappy with White's children's books, and she let White and Ursula know, and basically Ursula backed up White and said, "He's my guy. Sorry, we're going to agree to disagree."
And so, with Anne Carroll Moore being the most widely known, like the authority of children's books, being the librarian for the children's librarian for the New York Public Library, probably the biggest city when it comes to publishing, the biggest library in the country at the time. Can you talk a little bit about how she was seen as the authority, and then along comes Ursula? And the conflict between them seems as if that she is antagonistic towards Ursula, but they're both working towards a common goal. Can you talk about balancing that story when it came to writing about the different interactions between Anne and Ursula?
They'd have several interactions, and I think they probably had a fairly fraught relationship. But I think Ursula was pragmatic too. Um, and just as an aside, one of the things that Ursula did was she got to know librarians all around the country. So she wasn't just relying on whether or not Anne Carroll Moore approved of what she was publishing or not. So she would go every year to the American Library Association's convention. And for years and years and years, she did that, traveling by train in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And then after air travel came in, she pretty much still traveled by plane or train because she wasn't much of a was not very fond of traveling in airplanes. So she broadened her horizon and met a bunch of other librarians, and I think that helped her too. Um, but uh, I think where they differ, the two of them, is that uh, Moore wanted to be the undisputed expert, and actually she was for a long time. But that made her the expert of the status quo, and Ursula didn't believe in the status quo. She wanted books to come out that were uh, not sweet books that with happy endings all the time. She knew life wasn't always rosy, and so um, she encouraged her writers, and she found writers who would break the mold in a lot of ways, and she just supported them when they did that.
And one of the things that I think is interesting about this shift between Anne Carroll Moore, and Ursula is that at the time, the primary customer for children's books were schools and libraries. And with Ursula, there became a shift of marketing towards parents because when it comes to anything written for young audiences, the primary people with the purchasing power, and it feels kind of gross to be talking about children's books and art in the framework of selling something, but it's true. The people with the purchasing power are the adults around the children. Can you talk a little bit about what when it came to marketing towards parents? Is there anything that you can add to Ursula's strategy and Harper and Rowe's strategy when it came to broadening the market for children's books?
Yeah, well, you're certainly right that that libraries, both public and school libraries, were the vast majority of people buying books, because in the 30s and 40s, not that many people had books at home. For one thing, because at that point there were only hardcover books, which were more expensive. Is really before the era of paperback books. And so uh, I think right around World War II, 75% of all the children's books in the country were bought by librarians or public and school librarians. So Ursula wanted to expand that, maybe because well, and here's the other thing about where this comes up in my book. Ursula uh, was really good friends with Margaret Weiss Brown. They were like 3 months apart in age. They both lived in Greenwich Village. Um, they both were very, very interested in children's literature and writing well for children. And they bounced ideas off each other all the time. But Margaret Weiss Brown was a student uh, at the school in New York, whose name is escaping me at the moment. I'll come to it. Um, that that was interested in more progressive ideas about children, and children should learn through playing and learn through doing things rather than just being taught rotely. And that was a Bank Street. It was on Bank Street in New York. So it's called the Bank Street School, and they had two schools actually. They had a school for nursery age children, and they also had a school for teaching teachers how to be how to teach nursery age children. And so, uh, Moore didn't like Bank Street or its progressive ideas at all. And so I think, Ursula may have been, uh, I think, Anne Carroll Moore's broad brush of not liking, Margaret Weiss Brown may have slopped over into Ursula too, because Ursula was a proponent of Margaret Weiss Brown. So that's kinda how that happened.
And a little bit about talking about the progressive ideas, and this kind of reflects perfectly with how children's literature has evolved. And one of the things that I cherish in what I do here on this show is I get to highlight new stories by diverse authors. Queer, trans, and queer and trans voices are more prevalent in publishing now than they've ever been. And Ursula lived in a time in the middle of the 20th century where being openly queer wasn't accepted. Can you talk a little bit about Ursula's relationship with Mary?
Yeah, as I've mentioned, they saw each other outside of work, and they just enjoyed each other. Um, and uh, they would go to lunch together. In Greenwich Village, they would do things together. They went to Children's Book Week event together. Um, and I talk a lot about things that they didn't have in common in the book. But what they did have in common is that they both had relationships with women. Um, at the time that they were friends, most of that time, um, uh, Margaret Weiss Brown was in a relationship with a much older woman, and Ursula began a relationship with the advertising manager at Harper and Row. It may have been Harper Brothers at the time, but in any event, um, and so they both had that in common. Um, And also, as it turns out, many of the, illustrators and authors who Ursula published, were also gay. Um, and I don't know that that was Ursula's intent. I really don't know that one way or another, but, most people were keeping it quiet. Maurice Sendak, for instance, didn't reveal that he was gay until after his parents died, um, to the public. Ursula obviously knew. Margaret Weiss Brown knew. I mean, people within the industry knew. Most people didn't know Ursula was gay. And I don't know whether that was because it just she didn't think it would help her career, or whether her mom was still alive, whether she didn't want to say anything because of her mother. I mean, I have no way of knowing. But uh, I do know that uh, she very carefully would not. She would talk about her. She met this woman, Mary Griffith, at work. Uh, she invited her to live with her in her apartment in Greenwich Village. They lived together for 44 years. Um, they did lots of things together. They did what all couples do together. They went shopping, they watched ball games, they took trips, on and on. Went to museums, theater. Ursula was a theater goer all her life because her parents were actors. And so uh, they just had what seems like just a wonderful, wonderful relationship. But Ursula didn't feel like she could make that public outside of her group of friends. And so she would sort of blandly say, "Oh, the woman, my apartment mate," or something like that. Um, and then eventually, right towards the end, one of her last interviews, she said that she was very fond. She said, "I'm very fond of the woman uh, uh, living with me," or I can't remember exactly how she said it, but it was the most revealing of all the public comments she ever made.
And Nancy, this is kind of going back to something that you brought up at the very beginning of the interview. You said that you said that you were starting this off as a picture book. Can you talk a little bit about the decision when you saw that another picture book was coming out, and the process of making that shift from a picture book to a middle grade nonfiction novel? How much of the picture book had you already outlined and written? How much of that had you had to completely scrap to redo from the beginning this new outline? What was that process like?
Well, at the time, picture book biographies were 1,000 words or less, and a middle grade biography is 25,000 words or more. So I think I did it with the courage of the uninitiated. I probably didn't know what I was getting into. But I had written the picture books, basically, mostly about Maurice Sendak and Ursula, and they're working together on Where the Wild Things Are. So that ended up being a chapter in the longer book. Um, and I think that uh, uh, I didn't want to, if you write children's books that are fictional, uh, you can you write a book and maybe somebody comes out with a similar book and you think, well, no one's going to buy this. I'll put it on the shelf. But you might not have done as much research as you would have for a nonfiction book. And since I wanted to write nonfiction and a true biography, I had done a ton of research. I'd been all over the country researching Ursula, and I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want to let her go. I didn't want to wait 10 years for, time for another picture book. So I just got into it. I discovered I'd sent one of my manuscripts to an editor I'd met at a conference, Amy Noveski, and we kind of bonded over the fact that we both thought Ursula Nordstrom was wonderful, and she was not interested in the book, especially after the notice of the second book came out, and so uh, yeah, and I understood that, and so. When I discovered that her company was going to start doing middle grade biographies, I thought, oh, well, I'll expand it. It'll give me the chance to write about a lot more authors than just Sendak. Um, and so I discovered that what I said, what do you need to decide if you want to acquire this book or not? And she essentially said, you need a book proposal. So I learned how to write a book proposal. So then I did some more research because the book now wasn't just Ursula. It was Ursula and 16 chapters about 16 books that she published. And in each of those chapters, I wanted readers to get a feeling for who E.B. White was, or who Garth Williams, who illustrated his book, was. And so I wrote vignettes about all of these other people too. So it really expanded the research. Um, and I'm happy to say that Amy Nevesky acquired the book. And then about 2 days, I was very, very, very excited. And then about 2 days later, I realized, oh my goodness, now I have to write the book because you only send it in a proposal. So I had, 20 or so chapters to write after that. But I enjoyed the research. The research, I mean, these people were fabulous people. Many of them had a great sense of humor. Uh, Ursula had a wonderful sense of humor. And it came up in the letters, the editorial letters she sent to her authors and illustrators. And that's why I've taken the liberty of taking a lot of those funny parts of those letters and quoting them directly in the book, because I wanted kids to get a sense of her sense of humor too.
And the book did turn out beautifully. I just want to say that. And the last thing I want to ask to close out this interview is the question that I ask all guests that come on the podcast. It's open ended, so take the time to respond how you like and give your final thoughts. Nancy, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Well, I am really enjoying this new uh, part of my career. Uh, I want to write. I am writing two different books at the moment about librarians, and doing the research for those. Those will be biographies as well. And so I want. I think I want to stay in this area of writing about books, or about librarians, or about the book world. Um, Maybe another editor. We'll have to see. But I've enjoyed doing it. I think the stories behind the stories will be interesting to kids, and I'd like to do more of those. Um, yeah, so I think that probably sums it up. I also because I write I write nonfiction on purpose. One, because I read it as a kid and I enjoy it, but also because I think there are just intriguing and inspiring people to write about, and I hope that this book and my other books will inspire kids as well.
Thank you. That was an interview with Nancy Hudgins. Her debut title, Books Good Enough for You: The Storied Life of Ursula Nordstrom, editor of extraordinary children's books, releases on March 24th. You can learn more about Nancy and her work at nancyhudgins.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show to new listeners. Second, you can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at BookFairPod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Fair podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.